Hi, Ananga. How are you?
Hi, Gayatri. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too. The other day, I was having a conversation with one of the students from a UC university, and he's a wonderful spiritual practitioner, very disciplined in his regular spiritual practice, has wonderful questions, thinks beyond himself, wants to do a lot for the community and society, and really kind-hearted soul. He asked me whether spirituality is can be just left at being personal, like an individual practice, or is it a necessity that one should join an institution, become a part of a society or a movement or a community, even though he likes associating with other like-minded people, but at the same time, he feels really afraid of getting into the system of bureaucracy and becoming a part of an institution. So I was thinking we can speak with one of our very renowned speakers. He has been a practitioner of Bhakti Yoga, in fact, a teacher of Bhakti Yoga for almost 3 decades. He speaks at prestigious universities, speaks at the TED and the Peace Conference. He has authored over 30 books. It is such an honor to have you here, Chaitanya Charan Prabhu. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Prabhu, for joining us.
One of your
Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting. Great that you have started this podcast. The podcast space is something which is expanding rapidly, and it's a very human way to get in touch with people. And we do have some devotees doing podcasts, but they're mainly males. It's good that Vaishnavis are taking the lead. So all the best and happy to be of service.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your encouragement. And I was just sharing that one of the books that I daily refer to is your Gita Daily and the inspirational quote. It's something that I look at every single day and seek inspiration. It's just amazing how you've been able to pull out such practicality in such an artistic, I would say, linguistic form from the Bhagavad Gita. It's extremely inspirational. So thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you, Prabhu, for joining us. We were just talking about, I think Gayatri was mentioning that she goes to one of the UC universities, and one of the students asked this very profound, thought-provoking question. And we just wanted to start from there, that people say these days that I'm spiritual, but not religious. I don't need a system. It's between me and the Supreme, or it's my personal practice. So it sounds appealing, Prabhu. What's the right balance? I wouldn't say one versus the other. How do we align both individuality and the practice as an institution in an association together?
Yeah. I think that's a question which comes up in everyone's mind sooner or later. I'll answer this from three perspectives. First is more of a personal journey I'll talk about. Second, I'll talk more from a philosophical perspective. And then I'll talk of it from a cultural perspective. So personally, I have been always more of an introvert, and I've always worked alone. Even in college, when I used to do research or write any papers, I was always friendly with people, but I just couldn't work with people. So my friends would call me, tease me, they would call me, you're a lone wolf. So when I joined the ashram in Pune, at that time we had 3 rooms and the 90 of us staying in 3 rooms.
Oh, we
Of
rose
course,
90.
we couldn't stay. But we were
That's the
basically
hardest thing
Right.
for introvert.
So almost 10, 12 of us would sleep inside the rooms, and then others would sleep outside in the ashram at various places. So I initially thought this was just what Krishna consciousness meant. And of course, in the spiritual life also there is what I like to call as the honeymoon phase of Krishna consciousness.
Very.
Because everything is so new and we have a sense of spirit of adventure. So we just can do a lot of things that are not sustainable in the long run. So for the first few years, I just said, oh, this is what Krishna consciousness means. And there was the initial zeal of being a part of a mission. But over a number of years, I started noticing that it requires, you need your own space. And initially, it was almost as if I was made to feel guilty. Not that anybody was intentionally doing that, but it was just, it would happen. And one of my services was writing, and writing requires concentration, and it's very difficult to concentrate when there are so many people around.
Yes.
And so then slowly I started associating with devotees who were writing. Now almost everybody, many devotees are writing books. We have culture of literary continuation of the tradition is really picking up. But in those times, 2003, 2004, hardly anyone was writing. So authors were far and few. So I started connecting with authors and they said, yes, you need space. And that's when actually I was introduced to the idea of finding our space according to our nature in Krishna consciousness. So slowly then I started also seeking my space a little bit, insisting, unapologetically doing that. And now, so from that perspective, anybody who is a little more on the creative side will need space. That's just the way art works, creativity works. I find that within an institution, art, you could say science, also has science or something like engineering or something mechanical. This is the process, follow the process. There is not much individuality in that. But when we are doing anything artistic, there is definitely individuality. So if we are going to dress the deities, there are some standard rules to follow in dressing the deities. But if we make everything rule bound, then every day the deity would look exactly the same. And there will be no room for individuality. So like that room for individuality is very much needed. And we could say bhakti is a relationship with Krishna. And a relationship is a personal, one-to-one relationship. And I'm going from the personal to the philosophical. So from a personal perspective, I did recognize the need for it myself. And I'll come back to the personal towards the end once again. And feel free to interrupt anytime you want to comment or reflect on anything or anything is not clear.
I actually really appreciated how you mentioned, you're especially giving the example of dressing the deities, because I love dressing the deities. And that was one of my primary services when I lived in New Vrindavan. And we used to look forward to these different flavors. And flavors is the spice of life. Even like we've heard in the scriptures that Srimati Radharani, she cooked for Krishna and not one item is repeated. And naturally, there is variety in personalities, in different kinds of emotions. There is variety. So spirituality includes variety. And if we don't facilitate that, then somewhere we're failing as a society, or we're failing as a community to fan that spark in each and every one of us, maybe intentionally or unintentionally. So it really resonated with your point. Thank you so much for so simply simplifying the need for diversity. And that's actually one of our strengths, actually, within our ISKCON society, the diversity that we have.
So now From the philosophical perspective, as I mentioned, it's a relationship question. And relationship is essentially at the same time, within the philosophy and within the tradition, there is an emphasis on association. And it is considered almost a impossible thing to try to practice bhakti without association. So the tradition is called not just kirtan, but sankirtan. Sang is do it with others. Satsang is such an important part. So eventually, when a group of individuals who want to the shared purpose and the shared values that are characteristic of those who are the bhakti path, and they come together, they may create some infrastructure, some resources for the systematic or smooth practicing of their bhakti. And those consolidated resources that are created become the what we call as an organization. So essentially, an organization could say the formalization of the facilities and resources for a community to practice the spiritual life. And within that, so philosophically, we could say that while within the Indian tradition, again, how do you define an organization and institution itself is a philosophical issue. Some people may consider even marriage to be an institution. And yes, it's an institution, but then it's required. The most fundamental institutions required for society. So a school is an institution, the workplace is an institution. So in that sense, institutions are just part of the structuring of life. So some structure is required. Now within the philosophy itself is the fact that there are three modes of material nature. And we would explore that a little bit later. But so when the organization is formed, organization is basically, you could say, material. Material in the sense that it is formed in the material world using material resources. It may be for a spiritual purpose, but it is formed in the material world. So it's like the example I like is there's a trickle of water at the top of a mountain which wants to go to the ocean. But that trickle of water wanting to go all alone to the ocean, it may be very difficult for it to get all the way down to the ocean.
Right.
It combines with other trickles of water. It becomes a tributary, and then it combines to become a river. And the river can flow toward the ocean much more easily. And future drops of water or trickles of water that come in, they will move forward because of the flow of the river. And as the river keeps flowing, so the river is like the community. River is like the community or the society. Nowadays, the word society has many meanings. Community is a more popular word or a more sweet sounding word, you could say. But when Srila Prabhupada started, he did not start the international organization or institution for Krishna consciousness. He started the international society. So it's an interesting usage of word. But the river flowing is like the community. Now, as the river keeps flowing, it forms a bed. And then that bed is meant to enable the river to keep flowing more smoothly in the future. But once a bed is formed, then it may well happen that people may come and form a dam on the bed. They are not interested in going to the ocean. They are interested in using the water for their own purposes. So if it were just a river, okay, that's there. But once the bed is formed, then it becomes predictable. The river is always going to go in this direction. And that's when dams are formed. So the dam is like the diversion of spiritual resources for non-spiritual purposes. That's what can happen. And that's where people start feeling, oh, this is becoming too ritualistic. This is becoming too materialistic. This is becoming too calculative.
What a
From a philosophical
fantastic
perspective, this
example.
can happen. So I would say, in principle, the institution or some kind of formalization of the structure and the infrastructure is necessary. But it comes with inherent dangers, and one needs to be aware of those dangers. So having said that, we'll come back to how to address the dangers a little later, but let me complete that. Now, from a cultural perspective, I was born and brought up in India. I was introduced to Bhakti also in India. The first almost 20 years of my spiritual life was in India. Last 10 years, I've been spending more than nearly 6 or more months outside India. And I have interacted with a lot of non-Indians, mainly in America, but Europe and Australia, New Zealand also. And overall, there is also a significant difference in ethos. In India, it's still a more conservative country. Uh, America, any other Western world is much more liberal. And one aspect of how this plays out is in the attitude towards authority. In India, or in general in Eastern cultures, where the cultures are a little more hierarchical and more conservative, if somebody is in an authority position, by default, there is respect for authority. Now, of
Right.
course, if the authority behaves in inappropriate ways, obnoxious ways, that respect may be lost. But by default, there is respect for authority. In the West, this applies in general and all the more so for religious authority. By default, there is skepticism and suspicion towards authority. And in
That's
general,
true.
there's a long history about it. It's not that respect is not there, but respect cannot be assumed because of there being a position of authority. Respect has to be earned.
True.
And in that sense, for the Western mind to associate spirituality with the institution, with its structures of power, with its hierarchies and authority figures becomes a bit something which I don't want. Now, we could go specifically into why this has happened. I think there are three reasons. One is the Catholic Church was a very rigid system of authority. And in America, the original Americans who came to India, they came to America, or that time it was the land of what they consider the Indians.
Yes.
So they came to break free from the rigid authority structure of the church. So in that sense, America began itself as a statement against any centralized authority. And the second is that also within the very nature of America is politically it's a confederation, not a federation. Like the states come together and the states give power to the center. India is a federation where the center gives power to the states. The center is much more powerful. So that whole idea, both historically in terms of religion, in terms of politics, and America is more the idea of the rugged individual fighting it alone. The pioneer years are the people who still inspire Americans. It may not be in the conscious historical memory, but the idea is I want to do my own thing. So because of all these factors, institutionalized spirituality does come with a red signal. It is, as in today's language, you would call it trigger warning. It's
Right.
something people do not want.
Carries a lot of baggage already from the history.
Prabhu, I want to go back to your ocean, the analogy for trickles of water. Like initially you said, we all have a honeymoon period in our bhakti, which we all did. We were showered all the attention. We were so enthusiastic to do so much service. And then you mentioned a very profound thing that bhakti is a relationship. So that means bhakti is not, people think that spirituality can be a presentation. Outwardly, everything looks good. So spirituality is not a presentation. Spirituality is our relationship with ourselves, with the divine. With this analogy, I was thinking like trickles of water. So one trickle of water is, each trickle of water is the individual part, our individuality. So some people might think, okay, the ocean current will come like in an institution. We can have programs, we can have festivals, we can move from one year to the other, celebrating together, but still not advance. Like,
So there are times when we may have to make our decision individually also. And so in life, when we face crisis, it could be a crisis of finances, crisis of health, be a crisis of faith. At that time, we won't be able to just go along because the river is there. So in one sense, while we are in the river's flow may push us along, but life is also flowing along and life may keep pushing us out of the river. And it's not just sometimes life pushes out of the river. Within the currents of the river itself, sometimes push something out of the river also. The river tends to overflow. So we often ask people who come new to Bhakti, how did you come to Krishna consciousness? That's an important question. But if you really want to get honest with people, the change the question asks, why did you stay in Krishna consciousness? So,
That's true.
because
More interesting.
so I think the individual intention is something which is important throughout. Is we who have to develop our relationship. And that's why when somebody has some issues with the institution, everybody will, because that's just the nature of the world. So often the way I phrase it is that the institution is not source of our spirituality. It is a resource for our spirituality.
Beautiful.
It is a resource, and I would consider it an invaluable and sometimes even an indispensable resource.
Mm.
But it's a resource. It's our responsibility to grow spiritual. In that sense, it's like a university. The university will provide lots of facilities to study, but it's we who have to study. It's like a
Yeah.
stock exchange that we can earn money over there, but it's our money and it's our responsibility. Now, we may invest the money with some stockbroker and that person may invest somewhere, but ultimately the loss is going to come to us, not to that person. So in that sense, the individual intention and individual responsibility are never lost. And that is one of both the fears that people have. It's also some of the unfortunate reality that happens, that we may outsource the responsibility of our spiritual growth
Yeah.
to the institution.
Yeah. In the name of association, we sometimes outsource as well. Like if I'm with devotees, I'll advance. If I'm chanting in a group, I'll chant well. But what is my individual responsibility? So I really like that bhakti cannot be outsourced always.
Yeah.
But so beautiful. I think what you really have emphasized here is the balance. The balance. And there is that serenity prayer that says that to know the difference or to understand when you actually need the association to progress and make progress and uplift yourself with encouragement and with association. At the same time, you need those quiet moments where you are diving deeper. So that balance between being a part of an institution and so you don't start outsourcing it completely, but at the same time, you do need that community spirit. At the same time, you do need that space for internal growth. And how those two can tie in together is what actually makes it really healthy. In fact, His Holiness Radhanath Swami had once told me in a brief conversation, and I think this was also when I had a little child, and all of a sudden I felt everybody was just moving ahead, and my life came to a complete
Yeah. There is that FOMO moment when you feel like you're
all of a
missing out.
sudden, you're tied in with a little child, which you absolutely love. Within a few moments, it's like you're communicating with an individual that is not communicating back with you for a very long period of time till the child actually starts to express and reciprocate. And you're just like giving on the giving end, night and day. And along with the hormones going up and down, you come to a point in a feeling that everyone is moving ahead and your life is just like, you're not making any progress. And at that time, I think I expressed something to Radhanath Swami, and he said something beautiful. He said, you need to be like an eagle. He said, if you learn the art of balancing, have you noticed how an eagle flies? He doesn't fly, he glides. And he said, if you want to fly high and for an extended period of time, then you need to learn the art of balance. So there were moments where you could drop everything and just run and do and take inspiration from every single nook and corner. Now is the time that you use for your internal growth. And read. Develop this wonderful relationship with the soul that Krishna has put under your care. And it was just something so beautiful that the art of balancing is such an important aspect of even our own spiritual journey, like you've been emphasizing here. Thank you for reminding us that.
Thank you for sharing that. And I would say, try to balance. I like to use the acronym ONE for this. Where one O is thinking that the institution is the only way. And the other is never the way. If you are a part of the institution, you can never be spiritual. You just get caught in extremes. What is O? And E is that it's the efficient way. Now, it's an
Did you
efficient
just
way.
come up with this?
Yeah, I think he just came up with it. He has the snacks for
efficient way,
the
effective way, whatever word you want to use for it. But I find that both the extremes have to be avoided. And each individual will need to find their way to relate with the institution. How close, how far. Your example of having a baby is a very good example, I would say. How institutional conceptions of spiritual growth will not be able to accommodate this at all. Because by its very nature, an institution is a tangible thing. And because it's a tangible thing, it will always look for tangible things
Yes,
as markers or parameters of success and growth.
true.
So that's just the way an institution will work. Somebody is a serious practitioner. What is the parameter? Okay, how often do you come to the temple? How regular is your attendance? How much is the responsibility you're taking in the temple? Or could have, okay, how many rounds are you chanting? Or we have our specific parameters. But they are important in their own way. At the same time, there are real life is not just filled with tangible. When you sing, even daily life, you cannot use tangibles. People think is money the source of all happiness. Money is a very tangible thing. But then it's important, but life is much more about things that are not so tangible. So if we consider Krishna consciousness is the expansion of our consciousness outside of ourselves to take care of someone else, ultimately to care for Krishna. So recently my brother had a baby and his baby was a COVID baby. So there was nobody to help. And I've seen my brother change in the 3 years, 4 years since he had a baby. The amount of responsibility and selflessness and maturity that he has developed, it's remarkable. And so in general, if we consider the point of the expansion of consciousness, then caring for another human being, that actually expands our consciousness. And if we are already in a devotional frame of mind, then while we are caring for another human being, we'll be doing that caring in a devotional way, with prayer, with a service attitude. But this is not something which can be tangibly measured. So within the institutional infrastructure, if we consider one of the limbs of bhakti, that is Gohyam Akhyati Puchan, sharing one's heart and confidence and hearing others share their heart and confidence. Now, this is not something which can be institutionally mandated or evaluated. The other two parameters, we could say giving gifts, giving food, that's hospitality, that's culture of caring. That's something much more tangible. It can be more easily done, and we can also do this. But that's why I found that within an institution, there are two kinds of leaders. There are project builders and there are community builders. And you require almost an opposite profile for these two things. There are very few leaders who can actually do both. Project builders are those who will build the infrastructure. They will have huge temples. They will have huge food distribution. They will have huge farm communities. So that is project building, and that's very important. But community building is more about sitting down with people, connecting with their hearts. So in my understanding, if you look at Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's life, the 10 years when he was traveling, that's more like project building. And the late 18 years when he was in Puri, he was actually community building. He was there, was entering into the hearts of his intimate associates. And even those who were from Vrindavan, they would come and meet him. Rupa Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, Raghunath Bhattu Goswami, all the Goswamis. In one sense, Mahaprabhu, we could have said he could have preached so much by traveling, could have reached so many more people. He was reaching into the hearts of those whom he had already reached. And So both are required. The problem is community building, it's the results are become tangible after a long time. It takes a long time for the effort, the results to crystallize into something which is tangibly measurable or visible. So I think that's the main danger of the institution, that the institution may start devaluing the intangibles because they are not measurable. And that's when if the intangibles are too devalued, then the institution will become more and more materialistic rather than remaining a spiritual institution for a spiritual purpose.
So I was just saying that, yes, I've seen greatest leaps made by new parents, like you were saying, and we were sharing our experience by parents and new mothers when they have to hit a pause in the institutional phase of their life and go deep. And I think even I have made a lot of personal progress when I couldn't do any more services. I could only establish a relationship with my daughter, and really in the quiet moments of my time, just go deep, just introspect. Where am I heading? It's been 15 years I've been chanting. So just measuring my progress, not in the tangible sense, but really internally knowing what is it that I'm heading towards? What's my goal? Was it what's what is really that I want between me and the Supreme? So I really resonate with that institution definitely holds a play. And on the flip side, I also wanted to ask you, Prabhu, that yes, we talk about the community, the association aspect that an institution provides, but also like going back when we just started talking, Gayatri was mentioning that there's a student and he says, why do I be a part of a movement and not just be a person of my own? But if we also go astray the other end, that just I'm just an individual, I'm just a spiritual person, we can be whimsical, right? Like a spiritual organization helps in preserving the tradition, the and passing down the teachings. Isn't that true, or can that be done in a personal aspect as well?
Yeah. One of the things which I have found is that rather than considering a spiritual organization to be one homogeneous unit, we can see that it is a network of many heterogeneous units with a harmonious purpose. That means that when I travel across the world, I notice that each temple has its own mood, its own emphasis, and the temple or the project is made in the image of the leader, whether it's the president, whether it's the spiritual master, whether it's the previous leader whose shadow is still extending over the project.
Hmm.
So the way Srila Prabhupada made the movement was also quite decentralized. We have the GBC, but he wanted each temple to have a lot of autonomy by which they could grow based on their initiative.
Hmm.
So just as we could have various physical temples which are autonomous in their own way and which will each of them have their own mood. So I feel similarly, devotees also need to have a network of like-minded devotees. And this is not just a psychological need, it's a devotional principle. Sajatiya Sangha. That we want association which is Sajati, of the same category, those like-minded devotees. So I am a little more analytical, intellectual. So I find that I look forward to the association of people who are similarly intellectual. We get into the technicalities of things and we delight in those technicalities. And although generally my role is answering questions, but even when I'm answering a question of someone, my mind is questioning my answer. And even if the audience doesn't question the answer, I'm questioning it. Say, I didn't think about this. Maybe this point needs to be addressed. So I have lots of questions and I voice them with my intellectual friends. And then we see, okay, how do we answer this? Do we have some scriptural references? Do we have some traditional perspectives? Do we have any contemporary insights? So each one of us will need to find that like-minded association also. Say somebody is into music, then they may want to go deep into music. The general devotee community may not want to go that much deep into music. Just a couple of days ago, I was talking with one young girl, young means she's about young adult now. So she was saying that she's trained in music, and in the community, it is that everybody should is allowed to do kirtan, but everybody can't do kirtan. So she was telling me that for me, when I participate kirtan, there's a tension between the spiritual joy and the musical annoyance. Because
What's your classic example? I mean, I totally can relate to that. And it's so beautiful. Actually, there was someone mentioning the other day that it was a Hindi joke, but I'm going to say it anyway. A very famous singer, he was actually sharing with Gaurang Prabhu. He said that, Sabse jyada tapasya, you make the Lord. You torture the Lord the most by putting anyone before him to sing. Just anyone that comes to your temple, you put him before the Lord to sing. सबसे ज्यादा तपस्या आप लोग भगवान से कराते हो इस that really resonates. But yeah, that is definitely so true if that devotee is actually feeling. But I think she'll be able to tolerate what is happening in the temple if she has that support group where she can do a little deep dive into her interests connected to
Exactly, yeah.
spirituality. So
I would say the same thing would apply to something like a mother also. If those who are young mothers, they have some sort of community of those who are in the similar
Support.
phase or gone through a similar phase. So from the institution's perspective, what you are doing at that time may not be very valuable. Of course, it's important. But it may not be valued immediately. But there is a lot of depth of immersion of consciousness that can come while doing that particular service. And that's why like-minded association is, I feel, an underemphasized principle. Just talk about association, but we need to talk about like-minded association. And when we have that, then the institution will not feel that suffocating for an individual. So going back to the answer to the starting question, we just need to find like-minded mentors, like-minded friends, like-minded community. Now, it may not be an entire community. Nowadays, with social media on WhatsApp and other places, we can form our own communities also, like-minded people. But at least a few friends. The spirituality is definitely about developing our personal relationship with Krishna. At the same time, it is very difficult to two things, I find. One is to maintain the motivation all alone. Because Krishna is not visible for us. We cannot directly interact with him. And many times the nature of the world is that in this world, Krishna is invisible and Maya is ultra visible. So because of that, alone to maintain our motivation is difficult. And even if somebody is strong enough, maybe they have done a lot of spirituality in their previous life, because of which they have the motivation. Still, spiritual growth can become a very lonely thing. If we are serious about growing spiritually, then often the values we live by are different from, or even somewhat opposite to, the values the mainstream society is going to live by. So then whom are we going to talk with? Whom are we going to share our heart? So saying that spirituality is just a personal thing, I don't need an institution. Fair enough. But if you don't need an institution, you need what the institution offers. And the institution offers a community, the institution offers an association. So that's why if one has like-minded association, then the individual in the guidance of like-minded devotees can decide how strongly they identify with which aspect of the institution. So the institution, we all have, you could say, a social identity, but we also have a psychological identification. That means, say, now we are all Indians over here. And when we were in India, we probably we're not so conscious we are Indians. We are just Indians. That's the identity, but psychologically we not think about it. It's only when the cricket match is going on or Pakistan attack India, at that time we think I'm Indian.
Yes.
But when we come to America, then we are consciously reminded,
Yeah.
oh, I'm Indian over here. And we may even become American citizens, but still we are ethnically Indian. So there is a social identity and there's psychological identification. And these two are different things. So the social identity, see, each of us has different roles. So for example, I'm a monk and most people see me first and foremost as a monk, but that's a very small part of my personal psychological identity. I see myself more as a author, a thinker, a teacher. And that I happen to be a monk is a minor thing. So we have a social identification, we have a social identity, and we have a psychological identification. So the social identity may come to some extent because we join an institution, or we are a part of we take avail of the resources provided by the institution. How much psychologically we identify with it and with which aspects of it we identify, that's something which each individual needs to decide. And they need the space to decide that. At the same time, they need also the guidance to be able to decide that. That's why like-minded association is very important.
Such a beautiful thing and such a simple way you have decoded it, I feel. And the very fact that you said that we don't have to look at an institution as one huge body, it's actually support groups, different support groups that have come together. And even so beautifully, you explained that every temple or every community that you go to and you've traveled to different parts within one institution can have different flavors because of who's leading, what their mood of service is. And that is all variety. That is all variety. And we can find our own safe space. And we can have few different. I was listening to one relationship podcast recently, and he was actually mentioning, he said that when you have one partner, if you're going to feel and think that you want to do everything with just this one person, you're going to feel incomplete because that one person has his own need and has his own liking. But at the same time, if there is a major portion of shared responsibilities of certain things that you like to do together, and there's going to be certain things that you like to do with someone else, like you go with a friend if you like to listen to some music and your partner is really not interested in music, but you want to develop this real deep taste and you're feeling like, oh, you know what, he's got different interests and I've got different interests, let's just end this. No, because one person is not competent to fulfill all your needs, and similarly for the other person. So when we find our different support groups for our different needs at the same time, it helps us become loyal in a way that, when I say loyal to the practice of spirituality, loyal to continuing with this journey with support from wherever we need it. And I think you really elaborated that so beautifully. Completely decoded it for me. I don't know how you feel, Ananga, but it was just fantastic.
I'm like going over with so many things, like community, like our institution is not the source. Like initially when I started out as a devotee, I'm like, yeah, it's everything. And it is everything because it's giving me all the resources that I need to move forward. So I love that analogy, Prabhu. That I love that the wordplay that you do, that institution is not the source, it's the resource. And just one thing that came up to my mind was on service. Like when we do our services, and initially we start out on doing a lot of service, the institution driven services, and we try to measure our growth according to that how many services are we doing? Are we going to the temple and doing the services? But then when the shift comes to personal growth, purifying the heart, then those kind of services, we balance it out with going deeper. So when someone really asks, like, how do I measure my spiritual progress? How do I measure that I'm really purifying my heart? Institutional seva might not be just enough equal to your spiritual growth. how do we measure our growth? How do we measure our progress really then? Like taking into consideration that we talked about tangible plus the intangible. So how does someone in their lone time measure their intangible progress as well?
I am not sure whether there's any clear answer. I can always give the scriptural answer that there is, we could say the answer is that how much are we attached to Krishna and how much are we detached from matter. Bhakti Parishanubhava Virakti Ranyatracha. That when we experience Krishna through the practice of bhakti, then that experience is so enriching that we no longer feel craving for other experiences. That would be a broad parameter of spiritual growth. That our attraction to Krishna increases. This is what I want to experience more and more. Other things, they don't matter so much. So this is more like a philosophical parameters for spiritual advancement. Now, beyond the spiritual parameter, we could say now, spiritual parameters are no longer definitely important, but this is quite abstract, or rather, not abstract. It is intangible. You can see it in particular way. So then there will be institutional parameter for spiritual growth. So I generally, with respect to parameters, as you may notice, I like acronyms. I think in terms of acronyms. The acronym I have for this is a sip of wisdom. There are spiritual parameters, and then there are institutional parameters. So institutional parameters could be how much service the person is doing, how many rounds somebody is chanting, how often does the person come to the temple, how do they come for the morning program, do they themselves do a morning program or in their community where they are. So there are institutional parameters. And generally the institutional parameters have centered on three things: how many temples are built, how many books are distributed, and how many devotees are made. Now, they are important parameters. I wouldn't say they are an exhaustive list of parameters. And every institution may also change based on time, place, and candidate. What is their emphasis at that particular time in the growth of the community and the growth of the project over there? But the institution will have its parameters. And the final is we have to have our personal parameters. The personal does not mean it's divorced from the necessarily divorced from the institutional or the spiritual, but each of us has certain challenges we are facing. And sometimes it may happen that there is this whole phenomenon of spiritual bypassing, where we use God to stay away from God. That means I feel very angry with some sibling, with a spouse, with some other community member. And instead of dealing with that anger, I chant 64 rounds. I chant 128 rounds. Somebody says, come for mediation. Instead of spending 1 hour in mediation, I will chant 8 rounds. 10 rounds I'll chant. That will lead to much more spiritual growth. This is a very reductionistic way of considering spiritual growth. Maybe Krishna is speaking to you something through your anger. And is it that Krishna is accessible only through the holy name and not through anything else at all? So we have to have personal parameters also. Personal means what the person takes as important, as well as what is specific to the person. Others may realize, that person may not realize immediately. So personal parameters means, if you see when Srila Prabhupada was asked, how do we know your disciples? And applied to all his followers, he said that they are perfect gentlemen and ladies. Now what that means is a person should be well behaved, a person should be cultured, a person should be somebody which others would like to be with. So if we consider the 12th chapter from text 13 to 20 in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is talking about qualities that endear a devotee to him. Yomad bhakta same priya. And when he's talking about these, not one of these qualities is associated with the devotional activity. Krishna does not say somebody who fasts on Ekadashi, somebody who chants 16 rounds before taking a sip of water, somebody who goes for Mangalati every day. None of these. Krishna is talking about Dveshta, Sarvabhutana, Maitra, Karuna, Evacha. Talking mostly about behavioral qualities rather than devotional activities per se. Why? Because these are also important.
Mm.
And sometimes they may get devalued. And this does not mean devotional activities are not important. Of course, they're important. But at the same time, this change also needs to be. Is the person becoming kinder? Is the person becoming less judgmental? Is the person becoming more, are they becoming more resilient in terms of facing criticism or facing reversals? So the qualities that are described are very universally appealing. So I think each one of us needs to see. We want to grow spiritually, means we want to become better devotees, but we also need to become better human beings. Become better. I want to become a better person. And what does that mean for me? And how much is my spirituality helping me to do that? Or how much am I doing that with my spiritual practice? That's why all these three parameters, the spiritual parameters, the institutional parameters, and the personal parameters will need to be considered.
I think I love the big sip of wisdom that you just shared. Thank you, Prabhu. It was enlightening.
That is so beautiful. Actually, I was reading in Bhakti Swami's book, and he says that spiritual life is all about transformation. So what becomes significant, once you're practicing spiritual life, you realize what is really important and what can just be background. What's the focus of your spiritual journey and what is just a painting, a detail in the background. And that could vary for individual to a certain extent. And he really mentioned, he gives this example about a good test is when you're squeezed, you're put into some trying situation. Give this wonderful example. He said, if you squeeze an orange, what are you going to get? You're going to get orange juice. You cannot expect lychee juice or a mango juice. You're going to get orange juice. So in trying circumstances, when we're really put into difficult situations, when we're tested, at that time, we kind of realize what we've been cultivating within our hearts. If we're at a slight provocation, we're only getting angry. If we're getting frustrated, we're getting dejected. If we're becoming depressed, uninspired, then that's what we've been cultivating throughout. He said, so every time we're squeezed, we want to check for the quality of the nectar that's coming out. If it's orange juice, if it's mango juice. So I think trying situations or difficult circumstances that we are put through actually give us an insight of the growth that we've made.
That's an interesting example. Given my context. Recently, I was traveling from one place to another, and I usually travel big fruits. It is a long flight. So somebody gave me some apple, and then I tried to chew it, and it turned out to be a potato. That very it was the genetically changed
Oh my
potato, so
God.
that it looked like an apple. I don't know how that happened. How this happened so hard? And why did it taste sure.
Oh,
So
wow.
one fruit can be similar as another fruit, but when you squeeze it, when you chew
That's
it,
the
you cut it, at that time actually what is the real thing comes out. Yeah.
And that
I know that quote of Srila Prabhupada that Radhatma also likes to quote of is one's greatness is seen by one's capacity to tolerate provoking situations.
I'm just also thinking
So
about
that's such an important thing. Now, within an institutional parameter, this will not be really seen so much, but it's so important for not just one individual to not just blow off the handle, but also for a community to not overreact to whatever incidental problems that come inevitably. So that's a good example of the transformation being in terms of when we are squeezed.
Wow. Yeah, there was another thing that
This can be taken to another extreme. I was in one country and they had a very strict leader, and that leader would intentionally squeeze people. He said, I want to push you through a hole so small. Only your soul will go and none of your ego will go through it. So I don't think
That sounds.
I don't think that's an approach to be recommended.
No.
So squeezing is something which life will do. We should not be doing it to each other.
That is so true. Actually, I was having a conversation with one of my teenage boys who was kind of trying to work out his plan of how Premanand specifically, he was trying to work out his plan of how he wants to do his medical, what he really wants to do, what classes he needs to take. And I was just reflecting. I said, if I'm really serious, this boy is trying to get a medical degree and he's figuring out what he really needs to do. He needs to do 2 classes of that, 5 classes of this, how he can. And he's organizing his life and his brain and his activities to align with his goal. And it just hit me that if I'm really serious about spiritual life, am I really sitting down and chalking out a plan that this is where I want to be 5 years from now? And what can I really do to facilitate and enhance my experience in spiritual life? And how many times do we really take the time to sit down and chalk this whole thing out to at least a certain degree? Like, okay, I'm really intellectually, like for you, you're really intellectually involved. You need that mental dynamics and figuring out things. So if it wasn't for writing books, I'm thinking you'd probably be lost. That's activity that your mind really needs would not be fulfilled. And similarly for me, if I'm thinking that I really have deep interest in music and learning music, but just the way my life has been, I've tried to do different things, or I have a need and my skill set for organization. How can I use those talents? Literally sitting down and figuring out. And I think that makes a very holistic journey when you try to take all your favorable aspirations and carve out a path for spirituality for yourself in the support of an institution as a resource. I've really enjoyed this conversation and I've learned so much. Yeah, Chaitanya Charan Prabhu. I'm just mesmerized by your ability to come up with these acronyms and meaningful acronyms. And actually, like what I felt was a question. And I was thinking when Anang was asking this question, like, how are you going to answer this? You know, it was thinking, and the way you kind of decoded it with the spiritual perspective, the background or the historic perspective, and then your individual take and approach through your realizations. That's another thing I think a spiritually elevated person is able to do, is share his or her realizations. Because when you're put through situations is when you come up with these wonderful realizations.
That's true.
It touches one's heart because they're genuine and they come for a space of deep realizations, come from a space of experience. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our viewers will too. I want to point out that Chaitanya Charan Prabhu has a whole series of question answers that can be found on his channel, his podcast.
spiritualscientist.com.
Yeah, we'll link it here as well down below.
Yeah, we'll link it in our description. And thank you so much again for joining us, Chaitanya Charan Prabhu.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it answered most of my questions. It answered a lot of my questions. So thank you so much for this illuminating talk.
I'm happy to be of service. Generally, at the end of my talks, I do a summary. Would you like me to do a summary here?
Yes, please.
Please.
So basically, I think our broad topic was how much or should spirituality be institutionalized? or do we need to be a part of an institution to be spiritual? So then I talk about from my personal perspective how I joined the institution, but after the honeymoon phase, I realized I needed my space. From the philosophical perspective, it is that it's a personal relationship. At the same time, it's to be done in association, like a trickle of water flowing toward the ocean. But then that water can be diverted, especially when a bed is formed. So there has to be vigilance. So that the individual intention is very important to get into the water and stay in the water. And that's why the institution is more like a resource for the spiritual growth rather than the source of spiritual growth. And when each individual is relating with the institution, it's important not to see the institution simply as a one homogeneous entity, but as a set of support groups with each temple or each set of interested people with particular interests finding their own community. That is a philosophical principle of Sajatiya Sangha. And there we won't feel so suffocated. So there could be two extremes in the approach to the institution. I talk about the acronym one. This is the only way. You cannot be spiritual without institution. The other ways, if you are institutionalized, you get so caught in the power structure that it's never the way. But rather it's an efficient and effective way. But how it will be efficient and effective for us, each one of us has to take the responsibility for finding that. That's an institution in itself and it's by nature a tangible thing. And that's why it will have tangible parameters for growth and success. And personal relationship often has intangible parameters. That's why each individual will have to find the combination of tangible and intangible that works for them according to their nature, their culture, and their particular role in life. And that's why, again, in like-minded association, we find that out. Now, how much the social identity of being a part of an institution translates into psychological identification their institution, that is something which each individual will need to decide. And for that, we can have the parameters for spiritual growth kept in mind. So ultimately, that's on the end of the acronym SIP, that spiritual parameter is we experience Krishna and we want to experience that so much more that other experiences no longer allure us. So spiritual attachment and material attachment. And then the institutional parameters will be in terms of how many books distributed, how many people became devotees, how many temples were built. It could be for an individual, could be more of how much funds raised, how many people cultivated or whatever. Those are important parameters, but each of us needs personal parameters in terms of becoming a better human being, a better person. And we have our issues that we know and others know. And sometimes we may use spiritual bypassing to get away from those issues. But each one of us has to individually grow. That's what 12.13.20. The Gita is not about devotional activities that endear one to Krishna, but personal qualities and behavior that endears one to Krishna. And then finally concluded that the institution is something which we all need for our spiritual growth. But at the same time, rather than mandated, this is the way you have to be in the institution. It's rather we don't outsource the responsibility for our spiritual advancement to the institution, but rather we take the responsibility. And then from the institution, the association, the support systems, the inspiration, individually we can grow spiritually, but the motivation may go down. And even if the motivation does not go down, the reciprocation, we are social creatures, the reciprocation may be lost. So Srila Prabhupada had that in his vision when he didn't call it the International Institution for Krishna Consciousness. He wanted to be a society. So there'll be project builders, there'll be community builders. And each one of us, according to our particular nature, will find like-minded association in a particular ethos. And that's where we can flourish in our. Thank you so much.
We love your summaries, Prabhu.
Fantastic, Prabhuji. It's amazing how you've literally summarized everything we spoke about. And the crucial important points. That's what happens when you have a brain like that.
Yes.
So
I only have a good short-term memory, not a very good long-term memory.
it was fantastic. Thank you so much, Prabhu, for your deep spiritual practice.
All the very best for your podcast. And I think we also have a good vibe with each other. And I think it'll be good if you can continue this podcast, invite more guests and connect more and more people. I think talks are more like a vertical way of sharing Krishna consciousness. Podcasts become more like a lateral or a horizontal way of Just it's an osmosis of sharing Krishna consciousness, and we need that very much. So all the very best for your
Thank
initiative.
you for the encouragement, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Hare Krishna.